The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. My name is James Floyd, and I am one of your co-hosts. I freelance write for Star Wars Insider magazine and am the author of Star Wars Crossword Puzzles.
And I'm your other co-host, Melissa Miller. I also do some freelance writing for Star Wars Insider magazine and other science writing. In this episode, Star Warsology is going to chat about wearable technology in Star Wars. Our guest expert today is Dr. Benjamin Smarr, who is a professor of bioengineering and data science at UC San Diego. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you. It's really fun to be here, guys.
Yeah, we are glad to have you.
I know we're going to cover a whole lot of topics, and maybe it will all flow from one to another, but there was a couple terms that I was hoping you could define for us. So maybe tell us a little bit about your background, and then also what the term health AI means, and whether or not we should be terrified of that or really excited.
Okay, and I'll try to keep these answers short so we can cover ground. Health AI is really just saying we have a lot of data that we didn't used to have, right? You used to go to the doctor once a year, maybe, and they're kind of like, here's your blood pressure forever. And now we can sort of say, well, I'm looking at my heart rate, my steps, I'm looking at how they relate to each other, I'm looking at how it changes when I change my diet. So we can only be aware of some of those patterns. But if it turns out James and I, have the same diet, have the same patterns, an AI can learn on those things and be like, James started this thing that since you guys are similar in these ways, maybe that's going to work for you too. And so we can imagine a future of healthcare that's a lot more personal or community specific and a lot more digitally informed. That's what that's about. My background was actually in neuroscience, but it got me really interested in what is the brain making those decisions on? Well, it's listening to your body. So how do we listen to your body and wearable devices?
Okay. Yeah. And this is really interesting to me to think about. I participated like a study where I don't have diabetes, but they gave me, one of those like Dexcom things and it, took my glucose and they had me do all sorts of other, wearable stuff for a week. I wore, Fitbit type of thing. And that all just goes into this data set as, sort of background information. And I thought it was really neat to sort of be part of that. And I know some of your work was in like female health too, which I know we'll get into. It's fascinating to me how little I feel like we know. I've been a woman for all of my 43 years, and yet, I have a, calendar on my wall where I, make little notes. I still don't know the patterns of my own body sometimes. So.
Absolutely. No, and that's a perfect example, right? The more that women can participate safely in an ecosystem where they can share those data and experiences, the more you might have AIs that can help you with that tracking or help you anticipate what's coming if you come into perimenopause. We don't have that system now, so part of my work is trying to help figure out how do we build it. Who are the partners in that? How do we make it safe? How do we make it educational? Absolutely. It's a great experience.
Right. Awesome. Well, Ben, why don't you tell us a little bit about your Star Wars story? How long have you been into Star Wars? Did it affect, any of the science that you got into later in life?
Yeah, great. So I grew up in central Illinois, which is not the world's most interesting part of the world. So it's kind of the Tatooine of the world a little bit. And so seeing Star Wars, which we had, I think, recorded off of TV on beta tapes, which dates me, I loved Star Wars. I watched that so many times as a kid. Anytime I was sick home, I was watching Star Wars. I know much more deeply the original 3 movies, of course, and the ones that have come after. I've seen most of them. I honestly am not a scholar of those, but I had the books, I had the starships, I had all the character guides, and I loved the variety. So as a kid, I was really interested in bugs. I was really interested in just understanding natural variety. That was really what inspired me. And this idea that you could make up other worlds, you could expand that variety, you could think across worlds. I just totally fell in love with that. Ended up also becoming a bit of a Trekkie at some point.
We love Trek too.
Yeah.
I think that's part of what appealed to me too, in fact, was this idea that you can make up these counterfactual stories as a way of trying to understand yourself. I found that very compelling. And so I think part of what drove me into neuroscience, in fact, which is what I did my PhD in, was this idea of trying to understand, why are the people around me doing what they do? Why do I feel the way I feel? And being able to bounce that off of religious stories, but also off of much more modern versions, I feel like that's an extremely important tool for trying to understand the kinds of themes that resonate, the kinds of motivations that make sense, the kinds of twists that feel inhuman. That's a great way to gain insight.
Absolutely.
I wonder, should folks like the clone troopers maybe look into this and you could help them kind of understand what it means to be human, but at the same time, help process the fact that they're made as basically disposable battle droids.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great place, right? If we think about the clone troopers and if we presume that Empire being resourced such as it is, they've put some sort of sensors in those armor suits. The naive view, right? When I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s, people would say, well, they're clones. They should all have exactly the same outcome. There's this idea of sort of nature versus nurture, and they're the same in both, right? These days, we know it's a lot more complicated than that. And so it would be really cool, in fact, to say, as they start to develop different personalities, different levels of, compliance, aggression, what have you, are there signals in their sleep, in their biology over time, in their diet that are sort of helping us understand, what is it that's changing in them that then changes their behavior as a result?
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about the clone troopers when we were talking about this discussion topic. What did you notice in your scientific field? Darth Vader's buttons, like we talked about it a little bit in our last episode. He lives on Mustafar because it's not hospitable to anyone who doesn't have like their own climate zone and filtrations. Okay. I mean, we're speculating wildly. This is not really true, but it makes sense, right? Like no one can live on a lava planet except if you have filters and, controls and all of these sorts of things. So, I mean, Darth Vader seems like the obvious one to me. Do you have any thoughts about what all is part of his suit?
Yeah, I don't know what's in his suit, but I presume an awful lot of these brain-computer interfaces or body-computer interfaces, right? So this is actually a really interesting problem in the field these days. We talk about health AI. If you have prostheses, like Luke's hand, like most of Darth Vader, well, how does the brain signal, I want to close my hand around that cup of coffee, how does that get to that robot hand, right?
Or someone's throat,
Yeah, or I mean, absolutely, right? How do I think about the force? I do Tai Chi for fun, right? And so you think about sort of where do I feel my energy in my hands as I'm going through these motions? Is he developing that feeling in his robot hand? Is that part of his ability to project the force at that guy's throat? Sorry, right?
Right.
I don't know, but it sort of supposes that there is some intermediary between the digital and the flesh that is keeping that signal true, right? That is capturing his intention and translating it into a digital signal that controls the system. And what is that signal? One of the things we know is that those signals, even just on the surface of your brain, they change based on the time of day it is. They change on how well slept you are. And so it becomes, in fact, quite an interesting problem to say, how do I train a machine learning algorithm to recognize those activation patterns on your brain, but in a safe way that appreciates how that context changes so that I'm not waking up at 3 a.m., with my prosthesis reaching for my water mug and smashing the thing because my brain signal is not the same as it was at noon.
Right.
That would be bad if you accidentally started choking people when you really meant to write something down.
It would be embarrassing, right? I feel like for Darth Vader's brand, he would try to pretend it had been intentional and maybe he was just having a really strict day that day, but he would probably be embarrassed internally.
It's very funny.
That's be a reason for him to be mad all the time. He's like, I'm fighting the suit and it's not doing what I'm doing. Stop fucking.
That's legitimate, right? Because people who do try to do brain control of these prostheses or, learn how to control a mouse with their brain, something like that, right? There are all kinds of very legitimate medical reasons people try to do this. And it is frustrating. The systems don't work super smoothly. The interesting thing then is to say, when do you say, look, we're making this worse instead of better, right? If you keep practicing, really all we're going to train it to recognize is frustration. We need to get back to a ground state, right? But it is very frustrating. It's one of the motivations of people in the field is how do we help that be smoother so that somebody who's already in pain isn't also that much more frustrated.
I assume you mean control a computer mouse with their mind, not like a little mouse.
I had meant a computer mouse, but the same technology pertains, right?
The living force, we're all connected.
Right. Whether it's with the force, whether it's with a little chip in that poor mouse's brain, if it's the thing bringing you your coffee, okay.
Okay. We're being silly here or whatever, but from what we see in Star Wars, with back to tanks and, buttons on people's chests and all these sorts of things, are we past all of this technology, that we first saw in the 1977? Is any of it seem clunky now to you, or is it sort of prophetic? Is that the right word?
It's still very aspirational. It's not the case that we're past it at all. And the clunky bit is the aesthetic bit, is the robots look like they were made to be action figures. One can make much more sophisticated microelectronics and control systems. But the fact that they know what to do, even with that sort of a clunky body, is the thing that's so impressive. R2 looks silly, right? Or C-3PO looks a bit like he has trouble walking. And yet articulates in every language seamlessly, and not just in the way that we've come to think of LLMs doing, but anticipates the need of the person and what do they mean by the question they're asking and how do I help them. We see Chewie like soldering wires together in the Cloud City, trying to put them back together. That's a pretty crude set of connections for that level of computational complexity. That's incredibly impressive. So what is going on in their brains? What is giving them this computational ability? You know, with the Bacta tank, I work at UCSD, of course, we talked about that. We have groups like Rob Knight's Center for Microbiome Innovation trying to figure out, you know, what do we know about the bacteria around you and how that affects your health? But we're very far from saying we know enough about that we can use it to really speed up your wound closure. That would be amazing. But we're nowhere close to that yet.
Okay. And what's an LLM?
I'm so sorry. Like ChatGPT, a large language model.
Okay.
One of these things that people, use to do their homeworks and then it says something silly and you're embarrassed. They're impressive, but they're not thinking in the way that we think of thinking.
Right. Okay.
What other ideas would you have for wearable tech in the Star Wars galaxy?
Well, the obvious difference is the Force, right? And as somebody who's really interested in the way that religion has shaped culture and vice versa, the way that changes our expectations of what does it mean to live a healthy life or a good life, every culture has had some sort of religious framework for these things. I find that fascinating. It's one of the things, again, that made me want to go into neuroscience. What is that commonality? But the Force is kind of real, so that presumes that there's something that could be measured, whereas in this world, faith is specifically the lack of measurement. That's why it's faith. And so, is there a wearable? I was talking to some of my students because they're, of course, more educated than I am on the younger scholarship. You have midichlorians in young Anakin, right? Are they changing over time? These would be experiments I would want to do if I was a Star Wars professor, right? I would say, let's find some of these Jedi. Let's put this wearable that can look at Force energy somehow. We have to figure out what that is. But then we want to know, is it just that Anakin is always pegged stronger? That's kind of boring if so. I might expect that if he's training in the Force and getting stronger, we can see somehow that change is registering. Well, now that's a really important educational tool. We can understand, is the intervention from Obi-Wan strengthening him faster or slower than the other students? What is Obi-Wan doing? Is that something we should adopt? That's actually a really useful way to try to think about the future of education here. Wow. What are the behaviors that we can digitize and how do we understand when they're effective or not? In terms of the Force, we also might think about what I'm going to call the color of the Force, and I'm going to say red-blue, right?
Right.
Is it the case that as Anakin becomes increasingly angry and corrupted, that our wearable could have detected that? Or is it only able to measure midichlorian density as an amplitude and not the sign inversion, right? The positive-negative side. I don't know, but that's the kind of thing I would want to imagine because, of course, again, that would be awfully useful to know, right?
Well, and I feel like we have a little bit of precedence for this because in Rise of Skywalker, C-3PO's eyes turn red when he's speaking Sith, right? So would your little wearable be like, Anakin's having those thoughts again, red.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and then the other side of the wearable thing is very similar to what's happening in medicine today because of these wearable devices and the AIs becoming so cheap. You think about how expensive it is to go to the hospital and get one blood test. It's the same amount of money to get a Dexcom patch, for a year probably. All of a sudden what that means is everybody outside of a hospital is generating clinical grade data all the time, right? That is way better distribution of who can we see than just who came through the hospital. And so if we think about the Force, I think there's this really interesting social dynamic where you could say, we know about Anakin because, forgive me, I don't remember if it was Obi-Wan or Qui-Gon, discovers him in an alley basically, right? Ooh, that guy's got the Force to him. How many kids is he missing, right? Presumably an awful lot. And so if there was this commercial wearable that could measure the Force, maybe we'd be discovering Jedi all over the place.
Yeah. James, I'm sure you remember. Is it like a blood test? Does he get consent from Shmi for this?
It is a blood test that Qui-Gon says, oh, I'm cleaning out a cut, but really it's a blood test. So there is no consent. It's sneakily done. And I wonder with wearable tech now, and certainly with a midichlorian counter or any sort of Force use counter, that then you can see some sort of muscular growth in Force use that over time it becomes greater because they're using it more. But is there the sense that people will try and game it now that they know that there's all this data, that to be like, I got to try harder to be healthy because I want these numbers to go down because I can see these numbers every day and my doctor can see these numbers every day. And so it's like, I have to try harder. Or, if I'm Anakin, how do I trick this system so it doesn't think I'm angry all the time?
Right.
Right.
No, these are very, very relevant questions, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of shame that comes with visibility sometimes. And so figuring out the productive way to help people want to be healthier, for example, or want to keep their grandma healthier is different than saying, gee, grandma, you didn't get enough steps again. You got to get your steps, grandma. Like that just drives people to not want to be part of the system, right? That's very disenfranchising. And so figuring out what's right for whom is a big part of the science, because the right number of steps or anything else is not universal. But then there's these whole social systems that grow around what is supportive, what is the right thing to push on people. If you're thinking from the point of view of the empire, are you trying to say, we think this number of steps is right for everybody, go do it. And the poor little Ewoks are like, dude, my legs, I can't. Or the Hutts are like, I don't even have steps. What are you talking about? Right? These become
it's one step a day.
Delightful. That's very funny to think about.
The crane picks you up and puts you down. It counts as a Hutt step.
Yeah. In The Mandalorian, it never got into it, but I feel like someone was gonna write a side story about this sort of Force, I don't know, better word for it, doping, right? Like they were harvesting, things from Baby Yoda. And my, at least, imagination had been like, oh, so there's going to be an episode where they're like using this to like create Force sensitive, armies or something like that. And we never got in there. I don't think we're going to, but I think someone at least was planting that seed. So yeah, it's like once you have this potential technology, there's some people that are going to want to appear or be Force sensitive. And then there's some people who aren't, because as they show us in like the Acolyte, I mean, that's the High Republic era, but the Jedi were like allowed to test children and then remove them from their homes and take them. So like, that's not really ideal.
Well, it's all, I agree with you, but of course it is all culturally dependent, right? I mean, you could say the same thing about how they select the Dalai Lama, which is less likely to be seen as a crime. It's certainly, if it was my kid, I might object, but I don't know. It hasn't come up in my life. But yeah, how do you make these decisions is really important discussions. And when the technology spreads faster than regulation or social norms can adapt, that's when you end up in interesting times, right? That's when people are suddenly doing, can I do Force doping? Oh, wow, I didn't know that was a thing to worry about even. Here we are, right?
And certainly there's a lot of concern that all this data is being collected and who is looking at it.
Sure.
And what are they going to use it for? Our healthcare industry going to use it to then judge, how much they should charge you versus the government using it to look at all sorts of things about you, which you don't want, or, big data just looking at it to find better ways to push your buttons to get you to buy stuff.
Right. I mean, some version of all of those things probably happens. I will say the people that I've worked with over the years, I think generally start from the same place of like, surely if we figure out how to do this, we could figure out how to do some good with it. And that does encourage me a lot, in fact. But it's hard because there are regulatory barriers. There are different motivations from different parties. There are some populations that are really willing to share. And then that's what you learn about. And then there's all these other populations that very reasonably maybe are more suspicious about sharing. But then as a result, any system you build isn't adapted to them. And so are you going to, exacerbate the harm, not fit them, and therefore give them bad advice? These are all real issues.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to know what the Star Wars analog was, because that would actually help inform the dialogues here, right? It would make some good episodes to help us reflect on these issues.
From the examples I'm thinking of, it is mostly just sort of costume design and cool aesthetic and Star Wars aesthetic and things like that. I don't know how many times, other than Qui-Gon looking at that little, blood test screen or whatever, how much we actually see this sort of feedback, like in story.
Right.
I mean, this isn't really relevant, but like when we were talking about Jedi having a Fitbit or whatever, I was like, Yoda would definitely not wear one, right? Like, I feel like a little too absolutes of the the Force is or is not here. Like, I'm not wearing your monitor.
we were talking about this in the lab earlier, and one of the students was saying, well, if I'm good at the Force and my employer says I need to get this many steps to get my insurance rate, can I use the Force to make the wearable think that I've done that? Can I hack these things?
Right.
I don't know.
The other aspect is people, actively hacking it or trying to deceive the data.
Sure.
That's coming in that, I'll put this on my dog and,
totally.
My doctor will freak out because my heart rate and my sugar levels are not human.
Yeah, I had a coworker who his wife had gotten him a long time ago, one of the very early clip-on Fitbits, because she was worried that he was at his desk too much and she wanted him to exercise. And so he would clip it to the end of his pencil while he was writing. And it would wiggle back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And then at the end of the day, he'd be like, honey, look how many steps I got.
Yeah. And Star Wars is definitely that sort of galaxy where like,
Right?
there would immediately be corruption and hacking and cheating and stuff like that. Like, I feel like we talked a little bit about Star Trek. Like, that might be, in this idealistic society, of course, everyone in Starfleet uses theirs, the way it's intended. But not so much here in Star Wars.
It would make a good Star Trek episode to have them having these conversations with some new contact world. And they're like, why would I wear this tracking device? I don't trust you. I don't know what your motivations are. And they're like, no, look, we all do it. We live longer as a result. It's nice.
Right.
But again, it is the very pertinent social conversation, right? What are people doing with these things? For whom is it safe? For whom is it maybe a little more risky? How do we respect that? How do we help them find out what's useful for them? A lot more participant engagement is probably a really good thing.
Yeah.
Women's health is a good example of this. We started on that note a little bit. Some women in certain areas of this country, which coincidentally may or may not have the red associated with them also, they might worry a little bit about, is their reproductive health being tracked?
Yeah.
And they've seen that could, be weaponized against them. That's very damaging to the research because then they don't want to contribute. And so we don't get to learn about those people. And that means if their lives are different, we don't see it. That means if they have needs, we're not able to attend to them. I think there's very good arguments to say the Star Trek version might be a pretty good aspirational goal as compared to the Han Solo can smuggle you some hacked wearables version.
Right. No, I mean, this is a very real thing. As a woman, I was definitely warned, to delete and disconnect from all period tracking apps, anything to do with like pregnancy or reproduction because of, when Roe versus Wade was repealed, how's the government going to maybe, or how's any data center maybe going to use this information? And, me going back to like an analog calendar where like certain days are circled in red is like now what I do just because
I'm sorry
you don't want to find out.
No, I'm sorry that you're going through that. It's very sad to me because the opportunity is to suddenly learn much more and leapfrog our old systems. And, I will say government is extremely large in the way that companies are extremely large. Certainly lots of people in the government want to be of service.
Right.
But right, if you don't have good checks and balances and people can't actually be held accountable for using the data wrong, then you are at risk, and that's scary, and it's reasonable to not put yourself at risk. But that has this long-term harm to everybody else too. It's a real lost opportunity.
Yeah, and considering how much I love science and I love data, and the work that I do is in oceanography is all dependent on big, huge open source data sets. You're right. I did decide not to keep participating in one, so I'll think about that a little bit.
I'm not pushing you. I don't think what you do is wrong at all. I don't want that to be what you take away. I'm just saying, like you said, because the data are open, you can do your oceanography. That's not the case in health. And so we have to think about, if that's what we want, how do we make a safer world where people want to participate and are safe to do so? That's not a science problem. That's a policy problem, right? That's a social problem.
That's a trust thing.
It's a trust thing. Trust is hard.
Yeah, if I lived in Norway, I would sign back up or something. I don't know. It really is just sort of one of those things. Anyway, side topic there. But I mean, women's health in Star Wars is a little bit lacking too, perhaps.
It's a little bit lacking. I listened to your feminism episode because I listened to a few episodes to just sort of get the speed. You have fantastic guests on, by the way. I was so impressed. I feel very honored to be on this role. But, they made the point that almost all of the spoken lines are male. The character representation is almost entirely male. I think you have sort of Leia and Mon Mothma being the only two female officers of command rank of some sort,
right?
At least in the first few movies. So yeah, then we have these things like Padme is surprised that she's having twins, and you're like, well, wait a minute though. This is like Princess in Britain not having basic OBGYN care. Like, what are you doing? What is going on? Right?
Right.
She's not on the run at the time. She is like at the Senate, right?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
She's got all the resources in the world. How have they not developed better tech for this? Again, talking to my students, trying to figure out the in-world explanation, one of the things that came up was we said, well, on Earth we have pretty much one group of people that we worry about pregnancy in, which is women with functioning uteruses. In Star Wars you have, I don't even know, hundreds of species. I don't take for granted that Bosk is this lizard bounty hunter, right? I have no idea if he came from an egg, if he came from a womb, if it's live birth or not.
Right.
Was he a part of a clutch, right? I have no idea. So we know on Earth there's all kinds of ways that sex happens, right? There's all kinds of different mixes of chromosomes that, some organisms end up with dozens of what we would call sexes by genetic standards. It gets complex and weird, right? Which is kind of cool. I have no idea what's going on, but it's a much harder problem to say, not just can I develop healthcare for humans, but can I develop healthcare that works on, the spider people from the Nebula planet or whatever, right?
Right.
So, okay, maybe they need a really big research budget, but then they have more worlds. Maybe each world has some local knowledge. You hope so. Again, I think the aspiration is local empowerment to figure out the data patterns that are relevant for your culture.
Yeah, that she's from Naboo, which is primarily politically all humans. So you think that they would have the tech.
It's hard to excuse, unfortunately.
It could be, maybe it is a cultural thing. Like, we're talking about trust and stuff like that. The culture that maybe people of Naboo tend not to want to know these things.
So.
And so they don't get scanned. It does kind of ask the question, like, how come the Jedi didn't sense this? And maybe they're being polite and not reaching out with the Force and be like, hey, let's check the health of random people we come across. No, it's like, we'll respect their privacy. The other thing is that she could have known and just not told anyone, that maybe her handmaidens and chief of security knew because it's their job too. But it's like,
that's interesting.
I'm not going to tell Anakin because this world is crazy.
Yeah,
right.
That could well be. I like that answer.
She already didn't tell him she was pregnant for many months while he was traveling. And
she had names picked out.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, and just because I assume our listeners are screaming at us, is like, yes, we know that the answer is she had to, right? She had to not know, or Anakin had to not know, right? Because Darth Vader doesn't know later.
Anakin had to not know later.
Anakin had to not know. So we know that it's because of the plot. I just would have loved one little hint as to why in universe, because it does seem like such like a glaring issue for this woman who's on the capital planet and is in a position of, wealth and privilege and things like that to like be shocked. I like the cultural one actually, right? Where it's just like, we don't do scans or we don't, check for these things.
Politicians know to be cagey something.
Oh, yeah, even if it's a politician thing, right? I mean, she's already hiding who the father is from, like, everybody. Right. She's just not answering questions. But I like the idea you talked about, like, Mace Windu absolutely could have reached out and been like, hey, look, 2 Force-sensitive little babies in there.
Yeah.
But the fact that they don't do that, but Anakin certainly would have, right? As soon as he found out.
We were talking about the, wearables for midichlorians. I'll shout out to Lauren Bruce, who's a postdoc in my lab, did her PhD with me, and lucky for me has stayed around as a postdoc doing clinical work. She was publishing in a collaboration with Aura Ring, so shout out to them as well, that we were able to show at very high temporal resolution, minute by minute, day by day, like here's what pregnancy looks like across a couple hundred women that donated their data for this pregnancy study. And that's super cool. And you absolutely, with the Force, you would think you could say, gosh, this rate of change is more than you'd expect for one baby. Maybe you're having twins. There's a lot of information in these wearable data that we found for pregnancy.
Right.
But the flip of that is, it was 2025 when we published that study. Why is it 2025 when we're first looking at what does pregnancy look like at high temporal resolution? That's kind of primitive. That's kind of basic. And so maybe it's the case that it's partly because we have this cultural momentum that we respect medicine. It takes a ton of work to become a doctor. Oftentimes I'll talk to people and they'll say, engineers, and they'll be like, oh, well, I assume doctors just already know what they need to know. Like, how could I help? And they don't realize how good a job doctors do based on very little information. And so maybe that's the case here too. And that's especially true for women, unfortunately, that we just go, women are hard to study. I guess we're just going to not, sometimes it works out. That's a lot of my career has been pushing back against that expectation. But when that's what you grew up around, when that's what you see working around you, it's hard to challenge those assumptions sometimes. So maybe her planet just takes for granted that, occasionally women pop out kids, seems to go well, whatever. We put them in back to thinks if it doesn't.
Yeah. Thank you for leading that fight against the backwards thinking. I put out on the internet maybe a week or two ago about like, where do we see pregnancy in Star Wars other than Padme? And it's like, we know people have kids. We know that like Hera Syndulla is pregnant, but we know that Bix from Andor is pregnant and has a kid, but we never actually see them being pregnant.
Huh.
Right.
And so, even though the thing is about pew, pew, pew in space, again, there's only one time in
that's interesting.
The medium that there's anyone pregnant, and you don't, and that's because it's part of the story. Whereas, you could just have pregnant people in the background. The only other example someone gave me that was close is Frog Lady from the Mandalorian carrying around her big tank of eggs stuff. And in one of the comics, I think you do see a pregnant Leia.
It begs the question, though, of why do we assume the pregnancy isn't relevant to the plot, right? Who is the plot about? And why is pregnancy assumed to be sort of a side detail that we elide rather than a part of the journey, right? For a lot of people, it's a pretty big part of their journey.
Right.
And so if the plot is about, I need to have a young man who I train as a Jedi, let's assume the mom happened. Sure, then it's not part of the script. But again, that's really a cultural reflection, right? We're seeing in Star Wars the things that maybe we wish we were doing a better job of in our own lives.
Right. Yeah. And I was thinking about the acolyte too, but that ends up being like what is the word I'm looking for? Immaculate conception.
An Anakin situation.
An Anakin. Let's call it the Anakin situation. An immaculate conception conceived by the Force sort of, ideas. That's really interesting, James. Yeah. Right. Exactly. I hadn't really thought about the fact that you don't, and all the thousands and thousands of characters you see. Yeah, Padme, who, is just Natalie Portman with a pillow in a couple of scenes. And then the frog lady, who I'm still upset about because Grogu murders some of her babies. He eats them.
Circle of life.
Not a strong representation there. That's interesting.
Maybe not the strongest representation when half of the pregnancy you represent is eating the eggs.
Right.
Speaking of different organisms, one of your other things that you study is time analysis in humans and stuff. Can you tell? That was the best segue ever, James.
No, well, there are these different timescales, and that is in fact how they relate in my research. And I struggle in the way that you just did to try to explain it to people often. But in my mind, pregnancy, circadian rhythms, which is like your body's daily rhythms, right? Sleep, all of these things are useful to study now because of the fact that things like apps, wearables, you leave a pattern in the data that you generate at a high enough density now that we can actually see those patterns. And so we can start for the very first time to understand, not just on average people sleep 8 hours a night, but exactly what is the pattern of my sleep over time compared to yours, and what does that mean about our futures? So, one of the things that comes up obviously in time series analysis when we're thinking about the Star Wars galaxy is jet lag at a galactic scale. And that's something that they also never show in the script. They never talk about. You make a jump to light speed and you just show up and it's time for Danish, right? You're at the meeting on time. But we don't even know what the orbits of these planets are, right? You're on the forest moon end, or that just happens to also be a 24-hour period, even though it's also around this gas giant.
Right.
There must be all kinds of weird patterns, right? So for basic biology, right, the reason we have a 24-hour rhythm in our bodies is that before multicellularity, when everything on Earth was just single cells looking out for themselves, the ability to anticipate the sun rising and setting gave you an advantage over your neighbor. And so if instead of saying, ooh, sun's up, I guess I'll start photosynthesizing, you said, I'm going to start warming up that machinery because I know the sun's about to rise. It's like an early bird gets the worm kind of thing, right? You anticipate, you get ahead, you have a little bit of a competitive edge. Same thing if you're trying to avoid sunburn at noon, you drift down in the water column a little bit because if you're one cell and you get a sunburn, you're dead, right? and so there's this very, very strong evolutionary pressure to anticipate predictable changes. We're built out of cells that every single cell had to already come built in with its own little clock system. But those are really, really strongly driven by what was predictable on Earth. So they're good at lunar, animals can do lunar rhythms. We see this in tidal animals. We probably see this in menstrual cycles, in fact, but that's harder to prove. We see daily rhythms, of course, in everybody. We see annual rhythms in a lot of organisms, including humans. If the year is different on Tatooine, or on Dagobah or wherever, I wouldn't assume that organisms there would have a 24-hour clock. I'd assume they have a local time.
Right.
How are we going to get Mon Calamari fleets watch schedules ordered if they have a human crew and a Mon Calamari crew and some Wookiee crew, and they're all on different biological times? Mm-hmm. They all have a different length of native day. That gets really, really complicated.
And then they might need, for their biology, is we need lights on for the humans, but it's a lights off time for the Mon Calamari.
Totally that. Or when do we eat, right? Am I eating 3 times a day? Is it 3 times every 24 hours or is it 3 times every 40 hours?
Yeah.
How do we coordinate those things? That gets crazy. If you show up after a light speed jump, do you show up and you're like, oh my gosh, I am wrecked. I'm still on Death Star time and I'm trying to be here on Andor and I'm ruined.
I would do that all the time anyway. Just, I need a nap. Naps are good.
Yeah, that's interesting because I thought about it plenty for the talking about, an hour or a year or something. Mm-hmm. And I do feel like maybe it's Star Trek that specifically uses an Earth year or something like they standardize things or whatever. But even that's kind of,
really
egocentric.
It's egocentric. It's certainly colonial. B, your biology can only adjust so far as we know, right? So like I can't really adjust to a 30-hour planet, right? I can adjust to maybe a 25, maybe a 26-hour planet, maybe, right? But at some point, your clock just goes, I'm not keeping up. I can only adjust an hour to a day. I'm just getting left behind. And every day I'm farther behind, right? Every 30-hour day, I'm a few more hours behind because I only pushed to 25 hours or something. So yeah, no, Star Trek is a good example, right? We, for the sake of convenience, assume everybody is able to adopt an Earth standard. Right. And in fact, when Star Trek was being produced, we really didn't know almost anything about circadian rhythms. It's a pretty new field. Now we know that would never fly.
Right. And I just never thought about it in terms of, being on a different planet. And obviously, the 24-hour day is real specific. So, it has to do with so many different, factors of sizes and closenesses and, all that kind of stuff. But yeah. And
what happens when you have twin suns? Maybe the Jawas and Tusken Raiders and other native life are used to a bisolar pattern. And, humans haven't been there for tens of thousands of years. And so their bodies are still trying to adjust. And maybe there's times where it's just like, it's light outside, but this is the time of year when my brain says it's dark. So we live in these really dark houses and don't go outside for a couple of days until the sunlight syncs up again with our cycles.
That is a strong argument for the little thick-walled igloo that they live in, right?
Right.
Maybe you're right. Maybe they need the dark. Maybe there's a really large market of Imperial-grade sleeping masks on Tatooine, right? The dual sun thing is kind of cool. I like that you brought that up. One of the things we know about, like crabs, intertidal organisms, is because they do have 2 tides a day, and the 2 tides are not always even. So if you're not at the equator, there'll be sort of a longer tide and a shorter tide. They can anticipate that. They can train to both of those oscillations, and they can keep up with the fact that exactly when the tide falls changes a little bit day to day. They can anticipate their local tidal clocks, even though it's 2 different timescales that are interacting. So that is possible biologically. And you're right. Jawas might be really good at just balancing 2 suns. There's no way the humans have gotten used to that unless they have been there a very long time.
Right.
Do crabs still know the time of the tides when they're taken out of their environment?
They do. It's super cool, in fact. So you can, and people have done all of these studies to say, are they sensing the magnets in the planet? Are they sensing the gravity from the moon? Like what's going on? But you can take a crab from, let's say, I did my grad school up in Seattle, grab a crab off of Friday Harbor Island off there, fly it to Florida, put it in a tub, and it'll get active in time with the Seattle tides. It's anticipating them. It's got that sort of baked in the way that if you took me out of San Diego and you flew me to France, but you kept me in a dark room, I wouldn't get up suddenly on French time, right? I'd get up on San Diego time. That's what I'm running off of. That's where my momentum is.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah, it's cool. Shout out, by the way, while I'm doing shout outs, shout out to federal funding where a lot of these things sound strange when you propose them, but it turns out they end up giving us really important health insights about how we regulate our own timing in our own bodies.
Right. I want to take a tub full of crabs from Seattle to Florida, and I want NSF to pay for it.
That's it.
I swear there's a reason, though. I swear.
I want to collect crabs from every time zone and see how the tidal changes are around the world all at once.
That's it. We're getting crabs from different latitudinal lines, right? Different distances from the equator. We're seeing how quickly they adjust to some new set of timing. We're seeing if it depends on the light or not. Maybe we'll fly them up to and see if the magnetic North Pole matters. All of these things have happened.
Right.
I am sorry to hear that you've gotten crabs.
Oh. Well, and you also said something about with the crabs, something being baked in, and I was like, that's maybe a rude choice of words.
Nice. These crabs do need to sign waivers and consent forms and such.
They have the claws. They can grab the pens.
Yeah.
And make
there you go.
X.
Oh, that's interesting.
What are some of those other really long cycles? Like how would that work? I know that cicada swarms are something that are on super long cycles. There's plants that, will only bloom in certain years, but certain kinds of bamboo, I think, would be like all of them around the world will bloom at this one time. They know the time, but like humans are like, how'd that happen? So
yeah. Super complicated. And to my knowledge, there's not a super well understood mechanism for those things. Thinking of cicada cycles, there are arguments like if you can have different prime numbers, then you make the emergences minimally overlap and you help avoid predation or something. But these are all kind of just so stories after the fact, right? It's actually really hard to do the experiment to prove if you change the generational span that that's the effect that happens. And so we can say, well, this idea is consistent with the pattern we see, but it's very hard to actually test why did it in fact happen that way? Sometimes it's a simple feedback system. Sometimes you have, a peach tree in your grandpa's farm or whatever, and like there's big years and small years, and that's because after a big year, it needs a little while to recharge before it can have another big year. So you have these patterns of, it's making leaves a lot and then eventually it has a big fruiting year. That's easier to understand. Yeah, what makes all of these bamboo bloom in synchrony? What makes all of the cicadas emerge in synchrony? Super interesting phenomenon. All the more reason to continue funding science and figuring these things out.
Yeah. I like how many questions there are still that we're like, I don't know, magic maybe? We'll figure it out eventually.
Yeah. No, the way I tell my students is if you can still be bothered by anything in the world, your job isn't done. We still have, in fact, the vast majority of things we don't really understand or control. Largely, philosophically, I think the reason to understand something is to be able to exert control, right? Why do we study depression? It's not because it's neat. It's because we want to give people autonomy to control their level of depression if they want to control that, right? And not be depressed if they want to not be depressed. Given that we can't control most things still, there's a lot of work to do.
Have you found any student who's like, no, nothing bothers me?
Not yet. It's self-selection. Students don't come to my lab because they don't want to do stuff, right?
The idea of control with cicadas is a little disturbing to me. It's like, I want to control the cicada swarming.
Good.
I mean, that is a Batman villain right there.
Definitely.
Yeah, cicada man. And he'd just be friends with all the cicadas and be really active every 17 years or whatever it is. So.
Didn't you put him in jail 17 years ago? Oh God, 17 years.
Yeah. Sort of last Star Wars related question, and I don't know if you actually watched Book of Boba Fett, but there is a little bit of droid modification. The young folks in that show, showing them using prosthetics. It's not like just Luke's hand or, Darth Vader's limbs or something like that. It's like, a droid eye so that you can see different spectrum,
Sure.
Those sorts of things. So I'm just curious in terms of integrating technology versus wearing very clear technology. How does that come across?
I think the thing that I'm way more interested in is the information as opposed to the device. So that is to say, if the eye could be anywhere and not in my eye socket, but I could still get the information about, hey, that guy's radioactive, has the Force, whatever, I would expect that's the direction that the technology would move because the number of people that want to do even the not nearly as extreme stuff is pretty small. Does your employer think that you need to get your eye replaced with a robot eye so that you can be a better TSA officer or something like that? That's pretty extreme. I think most people would find another job at that point, if they had a choice. And so I suspect it's more like, how do I get that information in a way that is actually easy to integrate, that's actually easy to see, that's actually not requiring advanced neurosurgery with robotics? Mm-hmm. But I don't know. Maybe Star Wars is kind of cyberpunk and these things are commodified and it really isn't that scary anymore. I don't know.
That is at least what it comes across as in that particular show is like, oh, it's trendy, it's hip. It's this way that these kids, find their community sort of thing. So
this might be kind of weird, but again, talking to my students about this podcast earlier, we got into prosthesis control, which we talked about earlier. And it turns out that once you have gotten somebody trained to be able to use a robotic prosthesis who is not an amputee, but they're just learning how to sort of think their way into controlling one of these devices, they can actually then add that to what they can use. And so we saw, and you're going to have to help me here, the sort of the robot Jedi that has 4 arms.
Grievous?
Yeah, General Grievous, right? General Grievous has 4 arms, whirls 4 lightsabers, very impressive. We got to discussing, if I was Darth Vader and I needed all of these prostheses, why not get a 5th and 6th arm, right? Why not add more pieces? My brain is capable of it. The information technology is capable of learning what are the patterns that mean move this second left arm, not this first left arm. You talked about controlling mice, meaning animals, not cursors. But it really does start to get there. And you say, well, what really are the limits of what I can learn to control, what these interfaces allow? We've just barely scratched the surface.
Right.
Wow. You're talking about extra arms. I just imagine that Vader's chest box opens up and there's just a big punching glove in the middle that shoots out. He can control.
That is well within our current technological reach.
We did do an episode on prosthetics. I think the 10th episode, we had an expert on that.
Fantastic.
And one of the things that he talked about was kind of the individual self-image that people have and they see themselves. And so it could be tough maybe for someone like Anakin who always has seen themselves as a, 2-armed, 2-legged person,
right,
to then expand their body image to comprehend.
It's very personal, right? It's very personal. I can see myself as an evil cyborg overlord. I never was, but I can see myself there now. But 4 arms? Are you crazy?
Right.
What counts as strange and what counts as reasonable is very personal.
Yeah. Fascinating. Awesome. Well, are there any other topics related to all of this that we should bring up before we ask our wrap-up questions?
I will just try to do my public service and say circadian rhythms, sleep, really big for health, affect everybody, worth learning about. Sachin Panda is a professor here at the Salk, and Lynn Peoples is a reporter that I got to work with. Both have very good books about circadian biology that should be accessible, so I recommend those. And, when you're thinking about daylight savings time or shift work or any of these things that affect your sense of time, you're staying up late watching Netflix instead of sleeping, those things really do have big health impacts. So it's really worth thinking about, even if you're not doing it with wearable devices, even if it's not something you share. I do encourage people to at least think about those things in their lives because they can make a very big difference in fact.
Yeah, I really noticed that. So I work in oceanography and sometimes out at sea. Work is happening 24 hours. We usually have 12-hour shifts. Sometimes that shift is midnight to noon, and just whether or not your body can ever adjust to that. You have to tell yourself it's 10 a.m. when you're waking up, not 10 p.m. And you're away from society, so there's not like, grocery shopping and my friends and happy hour, but there's still light and, even just the AM and PM on my clock would be hard to sort of fight against.
Right.
So yeah, never enjoyed those. I think the worst I ever did though, where I really realized how this was affecting me, because daylight savings time sucks, but is, twice a year that we make those changes.
It's a little suck, yeah.
But when we go across some of these cruises, we're crossing oceans. And so if you're crossing an ocean east to west, you're changing time zones every couple of days. And so you're falling back or springing forward every few days. And I could never catch up basically on those sorts of transits.
That's you simulating living on a planet with a different orbit, right? You're moving against the orbit, so you're trying to simulate a longer day or a shorter day, and it's hard.
Well, and those ships are full of 50 people who love data. So if you ever need some people, I always say that they should send a psychology grad student out on every research cruise. But someone who's tracking...
I now do want those data.
Right.
Yeah.
Someone who's tracking circadian rhythms or things like that. Just get involved with scripts down the hill,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking that maybe there's something about people who end up being long-term cargo ship sailors and such. Maybe their bodies are more adjusted, and so the ones that stay in it longer are ones that have a better sense of being able to adjust time zones, either losing hours or gaining hours.
Could be. I mean, we don't know still a lot about what helps people to be more or less plastic or more or less resilient to these sorts of things. We all know the guy who can sleep 4 hours and comes out fine, right? Not me. So,
Not me either.
Nope.
So no, I mean, thinking about that is actually, again, when I talk about empowering communities, I actually mean things very much like that, right? If there's a thing going on in your cargo community and you're like, hey, we should look at that. Is Bill really that much more resilient?
Yeah.
Waiting for me to get a federal grant to study that is going to be a long wait. You can just do it these days, right? So I encourage people to do that sort of self-experimentation. It's as long as you're being safe and you're observing and you're not trying to give yourself a prosthesis in the garage, you can learn a lot.
I like that very specific.
Please don't give yourself a prosthesis in the garage.
I would say that if you're trying to do a prosthesis in your garage, you probably are learning a lot also.
Well,
right, but
I'm not going to recommend that kind of learning experience.
Right. Okay, well, for our sort of wrap-up questions here, can you tell us about your favorite Star Wars character?
Yeah, there's a lot of good Star Wars characters to choose from, and I kind of land on Leia. When I was a kid, I think I didn't appreciate her enough, but she is living in this very male-dominated political structure, male-dominated series of alien cultures. We see her go through all kinds of trauma, right? She gets kidnapped, she gets enslaved, she watches her parents explode in front of her. It's horrifying things. And yet she sticks to her principles. She wants to have a positive difference. She doesn't just become a weird Batman, revenge-driven character. She doesn't just go, screw it, I'm going to go be a hermit. She sticks to her guns and tries to make a positive difference in the world. And I am very admiring of that.
I like that. That's a great answer. I mean, Leia's never a bad answer, but that justification is particularly, I like it.
Well, where can people find you online, or do you have any publications?
Yeah, lots of publications. I'm easy to find. There's some talks on YouTube, I'm sure, also that you can look up. If you just Google my name, stuff comes up. But the lab website is my last name, smar.ucsd.edu. And it doesn't go into a ton of details. You need to go to Google Scholar to find all the papers. But it gives you a sense of the kinds of projects we're doing, the kinds of interactions we're seeking, the why we do what we do, the aspiration. And certainly if that interests you, if you're a Star Wars fan who happens to be independently wealthy and wants to support a graduate student, we are thrilled to name objects around the lab after you. Please reach out.
Speaking about your lab, what would you recommend for people looking to get into your field?
I would recommend that they do stuff and see what comes from it. I think a lot of times I talk to students who go, I want to be a professor. And not only is that a idiosyncratic path, but it takes a lot of work, but it also frankly just does take a lot of luck. And I've been very lucky as much as anything. It's not clear what that's going to be in the future, right? It's really not clear to me, if you want to learn a topic, why listening to me talk to you Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 50 minutes is the best way to do that. Like you have all of human language at your control. You can look up YouTubes, you can ask LLMs, you can email anyone in the world. What is the role of professors in the future? What is the role of education as a centralized entity instead of a distributed thing? I have no idea. So I wouldn't advise anyone to say, look backwards for what are career archetypes. We don't know what the career is going to look like. But you do know what gets you up in the morning. You do know what you want to work on. You do, because you have access to all that information, you have the ability to do a lot more than I did when I was a student. I encourage people to follow their North Stars in that way. I hope it's not too pithy. Once in a while somebody says, life advice, and there's this thing about do what you love. It's not that you don't want to do things that are painful, because everything takes grinding, everything takes perseverance. But you do want to do the thing that you actually want to do because it does require perseverance. So if it doesn't get you up in the morning, if you're like, I think I want to cure cancer, but I hate molecular biology, that's a great indication that maybe you should think about a different way to approach cancer. And maybe it's counseling, maybe it's being a doctor, maybe it's some other form of research, using wearables, whatever, right? You need to find that thing that actually motivates you and then try doing it and figure out what about it do you love? What about it is frustrating? How do you make the frustrating parts better? How do you make more people appreciate the part that you love? And see where that takes you.
Amazing. That's great advice. Thank you. I didn't get a lot of that myself in early academic tracks. So I think that's really an important distinction from just, the do what you love and you'll never work a day. It's it's not that simple, is it?
It's not.
Well, thank you so much, Benjamin, for coming on and exploring all these topics with us. I am always so amazed at how many things I haven't ever thought of about Star Wars before, and this whole episode is that for me.
Thanks so much for having me. This is a lot of fun. I really appreciate you wanting to talk about these topics, wearables, circadian rhythm, sleep. Great, great pleasure. Goes to show how great the UCSD network is.
Well, thank you again so much.
Yep.
Thanks, guys. Good night, and may the Force be with you.
That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Benjamin Smarr, and we want to thank all of you for listening. If you'll be at WonderCon 2026, come out and see me. I am doing a couple different things. On Friday, March 27th from 2 to 5 p.m., we're doing a screening of the 2010 animated movie How to Train Your Dragon, along with the science consultant, Stuart Sumida, who worked on that, and one of the animators from DreamWorks, Dane Stogner. That is called Helping Dragons Fly, Real Science and Animation. And that's in room 207. On Saturday, March 28th at 4:30 p.m. in room 208, we're doing Science of Disneyland. We did a similar panel last year, and this year we've got some new experts and some new topics. It will also eventually be a bonus episode of this podcast, so keep an eye out for that. And then on Sunday, March 29th from 3 to 5 p.m. in room 204C, we're going to close down WonderCon with our Mixer for Science-Minded Geeks. We've done this at WonderCon and San Diego Comic-Con in the past, and it's just an informal time where people who love science and love to talk about science and pop culture get together and chat about their favorite fandoms. And that is put together by myself, Star Warsologies, Cosplay for Science, Nerd Night Orange County, and we'll also have some of the AAAS If Then Science ambassadors there to answer your questions. I hope to see you at WonderCon. Come introduce yourself and say hi.
Are you looking for the links and other things we talked about? Check out our show notes page available at skywalkingthrough neverland.com/star-warsologies. Also check out our Star Warsologies YouTube channel where we post some episodes with related visuals from Star Wars.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or you know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Instagram and Blue Sky or at starwarsologies@gmail.com.
No topic is off limits, even wondering, since there are father ears, are there mother ears? We also have a fan group on Facebook. It's the Star Warsologies podcast fan group, so join today, chat with us and your fellow listeners. Please also rate, review, subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service. Please share with your friends. And if you like puzzles, my book, Star Wars Crossword Puzzles, is out from Chronicle Books and is available at your local bookstore or on bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and other online sellers. We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows about Disney, Star Wars, and Marvel, including Talking Apes, the Neverland Clubhouse, and the flagship show, Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also their YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History. You can find all that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies, where we'll be talking about cybersecurity.